Welcome everyone to another edition of Mountaineer Farm Talk. My name is JJ Barrett, and I'm the Extension Agent for Agriculture and Natural Resources here in Wood County. Going to be a fine day out today. I also have Brandy Brabham with me, one of my coworkers from Roane County. How are you today, Brandy?
Doing well. Excited to be here. It's a chilly Friday morning, though, for the last day of April. Well, almost the last day of April. Ugh, ready for that warm temperature to stay around.
Oh, yeah. And our guest today is Christine Gelley, and she is the agriculture educator in Noble County for Ohio State University Extension. Christine, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great, JJ. Thanks for the invitation.
Hey, you're welcome. Is it Christine or Chris? What do we call you there?
I'll respond to either. So whatever comes out,
Okay,
I'll be
well, I'm
here.
not sure. Some people get a little funny about that stuff. Said I want to welcome everyone that's joining us this morning. We are going to talk about spring pasture management, which of course is a timely topic the last few weeks. The grass is growing out there. We've turned a little bit cold for the weather last few days, but warm temperatures are on the way. Real quick, we'll do our commodity minute. This week, corn is at 7.86, soybeans are at 16.78, and again, wheat is at a record $10.68. For cattle prices, there were 694 feeder cattle at Jackson County Regional Livestock. Last week, 500-pound steers were $1.80 to $1.95, and 500-pound heifers were at $1.41 to $1.54. And a few other agricultural events that are happening across the U.S. Avian flu has spread to Colorado, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and Ohio, affecting 30 million birds in the United States. Across the central Midwest, dry weather continues. There are reports of dust storms in South Dakota. And of course, this dry weather is affecting the wheat crop. Definitely one of the biggest wheat growing states in Kansas. There will definitely be a lower production than their record 52 bushel per acre, which was in 2021. Right now, almost 40% of the wheat crop in Kansas has been rated as poor. So they are definitely on the dry side out there. Just another thing about nitrogen fertilizers. Of course, everyone knows that the high cost of fertilizer prices have more than doubled. Just a reminder, farmers are recommended to use nitrogen stabilizers or what we call urease inhibitors, such as agritane, to prevent nitrogen volatilization. Farmers can lose thousands of dollars each year to this effect, which happens to our nitrogen fertilizers. Okay. And that leads us right into talking about spring pasture management. Christine, tell us a little bit about this forage focus program that you do with Ohio State.
Okay, so once a month, most months, there's been an occasional skip here and there, but typically once a month, we have the opportunity to produce a 30-minute TV show that we call Forage Focus, and we just rotate the topics based on time of year and questions we've been getting from clientele, and do a TV show all about forages. Typically, it's myself and a special guest. Interesting as possible, get outside into a pasture when we can, and talk about what we're seeing. You may be able to take home and try in your own kitchen. We've done one that was related to sheep shearing because that's a critical task for our pasture managers who have woolly friends to manage. And we tie that back to our forage education. So we have a TV production team at our South Centers research station who is able to edit and post those shows for us. They're available to watch on YouTube, and they have recently begun streaming those on the Ohio channel, which is part of our public broadcasting system here in Ohio. So whenever people get on to watch the governor's address, that's on the Ohio channel. And we've been given an occasional slot to run the show there. So we'll actually be on PBS tomorrow at 1:30 in the afternoon. So that's been an exciting development, and that's something we plan to continue into the future.
That sounds great. What's the topic for this month?
This month, well, the one that'll be on TV tomorrow is spring pasture management. So a lot of what we'll probably talk about today. And then the episode that's coming out next will be specifically about selecting hay for horses. My colleague Cliff and I kind of set up an example where we were at a hay auction and we had 4 different hays to choose from with the idea of feeding it to some horses, and walked through a decision-making process on what we would bid on, what we would avoid, and why.
Oh, well, that's pretty cool. I know that we have to be careful sometimes with some of the hay selection for horses. Can't be too dusty. Um, can't have too many legumes in it. I know that a lot of horse owners may argue with us, but they really like that grass hay, don't they, Christine?
Yes, I do. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about what a horse may or may not need, depending on phase of production and what type of articles you're reading. So oftentimes I think our horse producers are overspending on feed because they may actually be pursuing quality that they don't need for the production of their horse. And that can hurt them in the long run when many of them are purchasing all of their feed from another source. So those are some of the things we tried to hit in that episode that will be coming out next. And so things like that, we just try to cater it to whatever questions we're hearing in the community so we can be helpful.
Yeah, the so today is going to be spring pasture management. So today's kind of a warm up for your new episode of uh, talking about on Forage Focus. What I guess to start out, why is grassland management or pasture management so important for a lot of our livestock farms?
Well, in the area that we're in here, that's often the best suited management system we can have on farm with our topography and our soil types. So the grassland is incredibly important because it helps provide biodiversity, it helps improve soil texture, um, it helps prevent erosion, especially in areas that have been previously disturbed. And then what do we do with it? If it was once forest land and then potentially was mined or turned into some other disturbed landscape for a certain purpose, it's often difficult to return to an agronomic system. And if we returned it to a forest system, that would take decades to do. So, in my opinion, the most practical way to utilize those spaces is to turn them back into a grassland. And that's one of those ways that we can build up that soil organic matter in the top layer of the soil so that it continues to build its productive ability over time. And at the same time, we're growing an ideal food source for animals that I personally really enjoy eating myself: cattle, sheep, goats. If we have the opportunity to grow food from what would be a less than ideal system, that's a win for everybody. It's a win for the soil, it's a win for the animals, and it's a win for the farmers. So I think oftentimes our grassland ecosystems aren't looked at for their full potential value, but we need to manage them as if they're one of the most valuable assets we have on our farms.
Yeah, definitely. For lots of southeastern Ohio and lots of hillsides and hollers in West Virginia, um, pasture management is extremely important. It's probably the cheapest source of feed for our livestock. Um, Christine, what before we get more into that, tell us a little bit about um, the research station there in Bell Valley. I know that it's pretty good size, and they have a flock of sheep and some cattle. Tell us a little bit about that Eastern Ohio Research Development Station there.
Sure. So the Eastern Agricultural Research Station here, it's located closer to Bell Valley than to Caldwell. So some people tell you it's in Bell Valley, Some will tell you it's in Caldwell, but it's actually split into 2 units. So there's another unit that's further south in the county. So really, we just talk about it as being here in Noble County in the Caldwell area. In total, the station has about 2,000 acres, almost all managed as pasture. It does have some forest, but we don't really grow any row crops at the station. It's primarily pasture-based systems. We have a herd of about 400 to 450 mama cows there. They are Angus Scimitar primary base, but they're commercial bred for consistency with our research projects. So depending on what the demand is for the year, we're maintaining those numbers of around 400. And those are split into spring calving groups and also fall calving groups.
Well, that's a lot of cow for one outfit.
Yeah, it is. And so having those 2 units really helps spread out and get the appropriate distribution that we need. So our unit 2 was previously mined for coal, and that's how it was acquired. So we have fewer cattle per acre on that site, and we do put the cattle out on unit 2 rather than unit 1 because we need to have eyes on the sheep more often. So unit 2 has cattle, unit 1 has cattle and sheep. We have a primary Dorset with some Suffolk influence, a flock of about 350 breeding ewes, and those are also split into spring and fall lambing groups. One thing we do at the station is we lamb inside all the time due to predation issues that have developed. We've had issues with coyotes as well as black vultures. The weather hasn't really been a problem for us nearly as much with the sheep flock, but the predators have. So we really like the idea of being able to lamb outside, but the pressure that we have in the region is too great with mortality. So lambing time is always fun because the barn is full of babies. So if you ever want to come for a visit, it's great to come at lambing time.
Maybe we'll have to get a group of maybe that might be a trip for some of the ag extension agents over here. But real quick, I don't want to get too far off subject, but for the sheep, do you have any type of a donkey or anything to help with predators, donkey or guardian dog or anything like that?
Previously, they have had donkeys, they have had alpacas, they have had llamas as well. They did have guardian dogs previously. Um, None of them were ideal because they all have their own separate management. We actually, I wasn't around when they had the llamas or the alpacas, but they actually had worse issues with parasites in the llamas and alpacas than they did with the sheep. So they didn't stick around too long, but they did try that. The guardian dogs, there are some issues with having guardian dogs on university property sometimes. But the biggest problem with the guardian dogs was they figured out where there were homes around where they could go and get a second meal, and they like to wander. So sometimes they didn't stay at work. Um,
Oh,
and
they
then we also have
they're
a
moonlighting.
limitation. Yeah, they were. We also have a limitation of not being able to use lethal weapons on university property. So the primary method for coyote control is we do hire a coyote trapper to come and work there. But our options of dealing with predators in the moment are limited. And at this time, we don't have any guardian livestock in the flocks.
Okay. Now back to our talking about spring pasture management.
Mhm.
I know that a lot of producers that I talk to, and myself included, we see the weather warms up a little bit and the grass is growing, and we're chomping at the bit to get the animals, get them turned out, start our rotation. How does turning out too early affect our pasture growth for the rest of the season?
Good question, JJ. And that depends, on everybody's unique system and how much forage you have available, how many animals you're feeding. But if we do go out too early, we may inadvertently stress our forage and our root system, um, and get ourselves off on the wrong foot for the whole season if we overgraze that really early spring growth. We may also see some issues with our animals if we don't provide a good acclimation period, switching from, primarily stored feeds, even if they've been fed on pasture, over to that lush green grass growth. Um, we talk about it all the time. I don't see a lot of issues with it, but grass tetany is always a concern with early spring forage growth and grazing, both with cattle and with small ruminants. When that grass growth really picks up, what happens is we get a lot of potassium in the plants and low levels of magnesium, and that translates to low levels of magnesium in the animal. And then we can actually have the symptoms of grass tetany, where animals behave really oddly. They may actually die. It could happen quite quickly because of that mineral imbalance. Um, so that's something to pay attention to as well in early spring pasture management. Is before, I recommend for all my local people, before you really turn out onto that spring grass, making sure you have a high magnesium mineral available for your livestock. Um, just in case, a little extra magnesium is not going to hurt them, but it will definitely help you counteract those symptoms of grass tetany if that winds up being something you're dealing with. But um, something we've been encountering here in our region lately is extremely wet springs. And so sometimes that damage that we cause with the early spring grazing is less to the grass and more to the soil. And then we're stuck dealing with that the rest of the
Christine, you're
season as
stealing my
well.
you're getting ahead of me here. You're stealing my question. um, yeah, I want to go back real quick. You talked about an acclimation period, and I think that that's something that we may talk about real quick. Are you talking about, at least I recommend or I try um, to have some free choice hay, even when we get into or we've got some grass growth that because that spring grass does have a lot of water in it, and we can still. What do you think about offering hay clear up into well into spring, just for if anything else, some chew factor or um, rumination for the livestock.
Yeah, definitely. I recommend having some of that lower quality forage that you may have in storage. The that late matured first cutting hay you might have laying around, that patriotic hay we sometimes wind up making. That could be a good use for it to add that fiber. Um, Especially, I'd say, if you have dairy animals, nobody wants to be dealing with extremely loose stool in a milking parlor. So keeping, your fiber levels up so that your rate of passage through the animal stays pretty consistent. That's going to make all your labor a lot more pleasant. But it also is going to regulate that intake for your animal. So um, keeping that fibrous feed available to help even out what's happening in the digestive system and slow down the rate of passage is still important. Even if they're getting good nutrition from that grass, it may be going through the system so fast that they're not able to digest all of it too. If the speed of movement is too quick, we could be wasting some nutrients if we can't slow down the digestive process.
I see that Evan joined us. What's up, Evan?
Going good down here, JJ.
Good. Yeah, Christine, the speaking of that, now we can get to the I call it pugged, I guess, pugging, or we get compaction when we get yeah, it seems like over the last decade we've had a lot of some pretty wet springs. What are some management strategies that some of our producers can do to counteract those wet springs?
Well, I think one of the best things we can do is just try to move animals quickly. We want to stay on top of that grass growth so it doesn't get away from us. But the longer our animals spend in those soggy soils, the more damage they do. So if we can almost flash graze areas when we know we're dealing with saturated soil conditions, that can help reduce the damage that we leave behind. So implementing something like grazing for short intervals or utilizing strip grazing systems where you can easily move the livestock to new areas, um, once a day or even faster than that in some cases, is going to help cut down on repeated traffic over the same space. We know a lot of that is limited to by your access to water. So it may take some real creative setup to make sure you still have access to your water system and keep those animals moving fast. But I think that's one of the most critical things we can do is just try to keep the animals moving so they're not congregating on the wet soil and creating so much pugging that we often see.
Yeah, I know that. Well, if for our producers that have a heavy use pad or I guess a couple choices, a heavy use pad or a sacrifice pasture. I know that sometimes those areas that we had fed in the winter time, we'll get to talking about reseeding those things, but sometimes we can, um, like you said, flash graze and then bring them back to a holding area till we get some drier weather. But we're hoping that we don't have that this spring. but
Let's
but we'll
hope.
see. Um, yeah, speaking of that, we always have areas if we don't have a barn or have a um, heavy use pad. If we have a sacrifice area that we fed on all winter, round bales or squares, what about reseeding those this spring? What are some ideas for what to do with those areas? What type of grass to seed that with, and so forth?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think some of that depends on how quickly you want to be back in that area again. If it's truly a sacrifice area and you're not going to be using it heavily again until the weather turns back, to colder conditions, you have more flexibility on what you can put in there. You can also try to do some weed monitoring in that time frame as well. But often quick soil cover is something we want to look for there so that we are covering up those exposed soil areas before weeds move in. How opportunistic many of our aggressive weeds are. They find a bare soil spot, they're going to establish there, and then we've got all kinds of additional steps for management. So as soon as we're able to get the animals out of those areas, I would suggest, even if all you can do is broadcast seed something on there, including an annual grass of some kind, like annual ryegrass, even oats if you have it, just something that's going to sprout quickly and help cover that soil surface to prevent the encroachment of weeds, I think is important to do. So sometimes when you look at pasture mixes, I hope you do, look at the percentage of the seed that's in there. The cheaper the seed mix, typically the more annual grasses you'll have in there. They're only going to last for one season, but this might be one of those situations where that's desirable. So if you can get quite a good mix of annual grasses in that spot treatment, that can help get you that quick soil cover and and prevent the encroachment of weeds. Clovers are fairly easy to add in there. You could even do some frost seeding while the animals are still in the pasture if need be. That animal tracking could help incorporate the seed into the soil. But if we're talking about like around a water system, that might not work so good. But legumes are pretty easy to add back in over time. So I would concentrate mostly on getting some good grass established there, doing maybe a mixture where you have 30 to 40% annuals, 60, 70% perennial grass. Um, just my biggest concern in those areas is what's going to get established in there if we don't plant something. We better put something we want, because if we don't, it's going to be something we for sure don't want come
Yeah,
up
it
in
seems
there.
like a couple favorites of mine are in my seeding areas are pigweed and lamb's quarter. So, and those are definitely two plants that we don't want to get established there on the farm.
Yeah.
Kind of tough with all the other things going on in the spring to get those areas reseeded, especially if it stays wet. Um, what about speaking of that reseeding and so forth? Of course, all over we are in the endophyte infected fescue belt, Kentucky 31. A lot of our farms have that. If we have that on our farms, how do we manage our pastures any different, or how do we dilute those or counteract those effects of that endophyte in tall fescue pastures?
Well, you said dilute already. And so often in our interactions with folks, we say, dilution's the solution to pollution. So if you know you've got heavy tall fescue, and most of us do, if you haven't currently worked to renovate out of it, you've probably got it. You have a lot. Um, so if you're not able to get rid of it and plant something new, one of the best things you can do is add in other um, types of forage to help dilute the issues we see with tall fescue. So if you have the ability to add in some orchard grass, some smooth brome grass, perennial rye, Kentucky bluegrass, to just help provide some competition with the fescue, that's good. Clovers as well, white clover, red clover, bird's foot trefoil. If we can add some competition to the stand, that's going to help bring down the levels of tall fescue that our livestock consume. And then the other critical factor is making sure we're paying attention to the rate of growth of that fescue. Because when it's at its most nutritious time, when it's in the vegetative stage before it gets seed heads, it's actually a pretty decent forage. It's when we overgraze or we undergraze that we tend to get into more trouble, because that endophyte is most concentrated in the bottom 2 inches of the plant and then in the seed head. So if we can keep our animals grazing the sweet spot in between that, we'll have fewer issues with the tall fescue. But if we just uh, ignore it and hope it's not going to be a problem, that's when we tend to have greater issues, often in delayed haymaking situations where we're too wet, we can't get out and harvest before it gets seed on it. That endophyte carries through in the hay crop as well. So mature hay can be an issue. And then the overgrazing as well. If we're grazing it all the way to the ground, we're exposing our animals to higher levels of endophyte. So we have a greater tendency to see issues in those cases.
Yeah, it seems like especially when we get into the heat of summer here in the Middle Ohio Valley, anyways, for July and August, that we'll see that a lot of cattle will try to go and stand in ponds. And of course, I get a lot of calls with people with horses, and I usually tell them to, if they don't have a lot of pasture, to try to, um, I guess, what do you think about, is it worth it if you have a small acreage for, say, you only have a few horses, to just go ahead and go in and do a burn down and reseed all those pastures to try to eliminate that Kentucky 31?
Small acreage systems are difficult to deal with. I would say yes, as long as you have the ability to feed in the barn or in an exercise lot. If you have enough feed that you can stay off those pastures while you establish them, yeah, because we know that the animals that are really at greatest risk across the board are those that are in late gestation. Um, because what the fescue toxicosis symptoms do is it constricts your blood vessels. And so if you're an animal in late gestation and your blood vessels are constricted, you're not getting appropriate flow across the placenta to your fetus. And so we tend to see issues with either abortions or stillborns, or we may have animals lose body condition right at the end, and they may be weak to deliver their animals. And that has to do with that lack of blood flow that's created. So that's especially pronounced in breeding mares. So it is a huge concern for horse producers, especially those that have reproductive females in their herds. So it is a huge concern for those producers, and I think would be worth the investment of taking the animals off the pasture, housing them, feeding them in a separate area while you address those concerns. It's going to be hard in those small pasture settings, because you do want your animals to have appropriate exercise. And we don't want to turn the animals out too early, or else we'll kind of undo all the work we do to try to get those grasses established. So it'd really be looking at taking the acreage out of production for a whole growing season to ensure that we get good establishment.
And I guess a lot of grassland managers, a lot of our larger livestock farms, they would rather try to improve those pastures than actually take say a 10 or 20 acre field out of production for a while and reseed that whole area? Or is that a viable option um, to, a section at a time to try to improve these pastures, even on a large farm?
I think on a large farm, it's probably most opportunistic to do it there, because you have more flexibility with your acreage. If you could designate, 10-acre sections that you wanted to work on every year. I'm going to do this 10-acre field, or this 25-acre field, or this 5-acre field. If you look at how much forage you tend to have available through the growing season and you find you have some extra, then how much extra do you have? That extra amount could be the amount that you choose to renovate each year. And so that way you're not losing the entire productive potential of your pasture, but you're giving some of it a break to improve it. And I think one of the benefits of doing that too is it allows you to tweak your methods over time. If the first year you try it and you decide, I didn't like that herbicide that I used, I want to try something different, or on second thought, that variety that I picked, I want to try a different one. Over time, you would have sections of pasture with your renovations that you could track what's performing best for you. So as you change your methods, you have on-farm experience of what has worked well and what might need tweaked for the rest of it. If you choose to do it all at the same time, well, hopefully you'll be successful across the board, but you could have failure across the board. And that could be painful. It can be discouraging and expensive. So if you have the ability to do kind of a baby step pasture renovation, a few acres at a time, I think that's almost the most ideal way to do it.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about clovers and some fertilization. Maybe first off with nitrogen fertilizer. What are your uh, philosophy, I guess, for? I know with we've always worked with Dr. Rayburn, and he's it shies away from putting a lot of nitrogen fertilizers on pastures just to encourage clover growth. What's your opinion on that?
Dr. Rayburn knows a lot more and has a lot more experience than I do. So I'd like to trust what Dr. Rayburn says. But it just makes good sense, especially, if we don't think about the clovers for a minute, we come back to the clovers. We think about the timing of nitrogen application. I do not encourage my local producers to put nitrogen on with spring flush of growth. If you think about the utilization of those nutrients throughout the plant, nitrogen tends to produce more vegetative tissue above ground. So often what we're going to see is an increase in leaves and stems, and not necessarily an increase in root development. And it's that root development that we really want to make sure is happening with young stands in early spring. We already are getting a flush of growth of leaf and stem tissue, often more than we can actively graze. So why would we put nitrogen fertilizer on to increase the same type of growth we already have? It's going to speed that grass into the reproductive phase, so we'll have less time to manage it appropriately because we put that nitrogen on. So do we really need a boost of vegetative growth in April and May? Probably not, unless you're doing a brand new seeding that needs a little bit of nitrogen to get going. But in a grazing system or a hay system that's already been established, I do not see the need to put nitrogen on before you make your first cutting. But split application after first and after second cutting, and even going into the fall, that makes a lot more sense. But still using conservative amounts, depending on how much clover you have there, because our needs for nitrogen fertilizer in legume crops are much lower than they are for grass crops. And it's true, if we provide more nitrogen, we will tend to see less clovers in the stand. There's opportunistic relationships between our grasses and our legumes. Clovers will not tolerate shading very well. So if we have really, really lush, thick grass growth, there won't be as many opportunities for our clovers to thrive in the in-between spaces between the bunches. So if we have lots of nitrogen fertilization occurring, we will have robust grass growth, but that tends to take away from the environment for our clovers to thrive. The clover needs some open space to access the sunlight. So we can get some free nitrogen fertilizer from our clovers, but we won't get that benefit if the clovers don't thrive in the space. So that comes into soil testing as well, and really communicating what your stand actually has in it when you fill those soil test forms out so that you get good recommendations. If you say you have a mixed grass stand, but you really have 20% clover in there, the recommendations you're going to get back from your soil test will tell you what to do for the grass, and they won't account for the additional legumes that you have. So I think, does that answer the question
Oh
where you
yeah,
were going with
the
that?
definitely. Well, maybe with the price of urea at $1,200 a ton may discourage some of your producers from putting on a lot of nitrogen on their pastures this summer. I think, as with anything else with agriculture, a lot of it has to do with tradition. And as I see in my area, there's always fertilizer buggies running up and down the road. Of course, a lot of our row crop producers are trying to get fertilizer on when they can. Um, but grass farming is kind of a different philosophy, and I totally agree with you that, and definitely even I think some of our hay fields, we may be better off wait until after we take the first cutting off to put some of that nitrogen on. Um,
Yeah, and we often forget how much nitrogen there really is in urine as well. So if we're doing appropriate pasture management where our animals are moving across the landscape, they're helping deposit nitrogen already, along with phosphorus and potassium in their manure. And then one other thing that I just wanted to mention here was the thing that I tend to get into conversation with my producers is, well, I'm just going to put on triple 19. It's got everything. It has everything that I need. So I'll just get a bunch of triple 19 and I'll put it on. And they know how much it costs. They know all the nutrients are in there that they want, but that often they need a bunch more phosphorus and potassium, and they don't need that nitrogen. But they're putting on that nitrogen at the same time. So it's almost counteracting what they're trying to do, and it's more expensive. But it takes more math to figure it out if you're going to use two or three different kinds of fertilizer. It's not one trip to the store, not one bag. So I understand that I understand where they're going with that, but I wish we could get a little further away from the triple 19 purchase patterns, because I don't think we're distributing what our pastures actually need if we're just going with, I'm going to put 200 pounds of triple 19 on every year and hope that that's good.
yeah, definitely. Well, this year more than any time in the last 20 years would be a good time to soil test. Definitely, with the price of fertilizer. We have any questions from the audience, or Evan or Brandy? Do you have any questions you want to ask Christine? Evan?
No, right now, I think you've covered a lot of stuff so far, and it's got me thinking how to improve our pastures at home too.
Awesome.
Yeah. Any questions from the audience? I see we have Brian Sparks there. Brian, do you have any words of wisdom from down in southern West Virginia?
Yeah, one thing I was thinking here, we try to, especially in the winter, talk about, getting our hay rolled out in the pastures and
Okay.
spreading nutrients around. And one thing we find sometimes with some second cutting hay that we put out, and maybe the livestock do not clean it up as well as they should, especially if it's a bale spot, like you put a bale out. And the second cutting keeps the grasses from growing back. How would you recommend, Christine, that we look at a seed mixture putting down prior to maybe setting those hay bales down and feeding that second cutting, or coming back after we fed that? Because what we see is it smothers it out, and then we have cockle burr and spiny amaranth come and things like that.
Yeah, Brian, that's a great question, because those are the things that I see come up most often in those spaces too. We have such problems with cocklebur, and then we tend to get foxtail in there about the same time too, and that one's hard to control. I think with knowing that that residue cover's there, it may be advantageous to pick a filler that has a fairly large seed, because then your plant seedlings are going to be larger too and more easily can break through that residue after germination. So my mind's going to some more winter or summer annual crops that could provide some quick cover in that space and still break through the residue. And then also be most competitive at the time of those plants you're talking about. The spiny amaranth, the cocklebur, the foxtail, they all tend to come on, late May, mid-June, and then cause us lots of problems once we get to July and August. But if we could go with a summer annual that has a larger seed like sorghum Sudan grass, even some legumes like cowpea, a lot of the cover crop mixes that are summer cover crop mixes, they provide a good mix of those grass and legume summer annuals. They have a pretty large seed and a larger plant. So hopefully we could help shade out some of those opportunistic weeds that are coming in the same time frame. So they would hopefully get a jump on shading out the cocklebur and the amaranth. And you might be
Yeah.
able to put those in with a drill, depending on your topography. I think drilling them in is the best way to go. And in that case, if you've already fed the hay, you'd be drilling through the residue. So a no-till drill would probably be ideal for that situation.
Yeah, definitely. Christine, cocklebur is a bad word here
It's a curse
in
word, right?
the Mid Ohio Valley. But I guess, what are some reasons why we've seen such the last few decades, an increase in um, issues with cocklebur, and how do we manage? Or I know that we always try to, at least a lot of calls I have is what do we spray to get rid of this cocklebur? And sometimes maybe we need to look at the root cause of the problem, which maybe be our management.
Yeah. I don't know where it's all coming from, but it could come from lots of different places. Cocklebur has a burr on it. So it's easily transported in the fur of animals, whether are livestock or wild animals. Could be deer, could be rabbits, coyotes, whatever's walking through those areas is going to pick up those burrs and help distribute seed. If we have cocklebur in hay fields and we're doing our late season cuts, we could have seed mixed in there. And then when we feed the hay in those sites, we may inadvertently be depositing seed. I don't know about birds, how birds play into that equation, but we have a lot of turkeys in our area that I think sometimes can play a role in how things get distributed. But I think deer are probably helping distribute this quite well. We have terrible problems with our sheep flock getting cocklebur all caught in their wool, and it's just terrible to try to get out. So I'm sure they're helping distribute it a lot on our research farm. Again, it's very opportunistic, so it does well in the middle of the summer. So we've got those like soggy, wet spaces that we talked about in the spring that then harden up into a crusty concrete mess in the middle of summer. And cocklebur doesn't seem to care. It will just come up there and it will grow fine with, 3 weeks of no rain. It's still there. And with those big, thick stems, uh, it's hard to compete with.
Yeah, definitely. It once it gets a foothold, I guess maybe we go back to as Rakesh, our weed specialist or IPM person. Once it gets over 50% of the forage in that field, then we need to go ahead and spray that. Would you say that that's a pretty good
Oh,
rule for?
yeah, for sure. I would agree. And it's fairly responsive to most broadleaf herbicides. So if you're working in a system where you want to preserve your grass and not have to replant, go with a broadleaf herbicide, something like 2,4-D um, something that has a mix of 2,4-D, dicamba, to try to take care of that. Some of the Brushmaster type products that have triclopyr in it may be a decent option. And you could go the glyphosate route and do a burn down of those areas and come back and try to replant. But I'd even say if you're looking at, 30% cocklebur infested area, to go ahead and act as soon as you could, because it's just going to explode. And really, from what I've read, the best time to get after cocklebur is before it's 6 inches tall. And it could go from seedling to 12 inches tall pretty quick. So you've got to be actively scouting.
Right, definitely. I think they had talked to Rakesh last year about using that crossbow. I think there's some other couple products that have, like you were saying, 2,4-D or dicamba. I know that 2,4-D, like for buttercup and things like that, it doesn't stay in the soil as long, the residual. So then you could maybe go back and put some clovers in, or um, do a little bit of frost seed or something. Does that sound about right, Christine?
Yeah, and it will depend on the formulation. So as always, any herbicide that you're looking at purchasing and using, fully read the label. It'll have restrictions for planting afterwards listed on the label. But like crossbow, I don't think has a planting restriction for clovers, but Grazing on Next does. I'm not sure about Remedy Ultra is another one that is often used. I'm not sure if that one has a planting restriction for clovers. But all of that information is right on the label. So don't be shy to read the label in the store, like in the aisle of Rural King. Look at the label. They're not going to kick you out because you're reading the product label. Read it before you buy it, and then choose which one's your best selection on, planting restrictions. If there's a grazing withholding time, if you have a hay restriction as well, all that's on the label. And if it does have restrictions, they do tend to try to make those pretty obvious on the first page.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Is it amino purulid and some other of those products, Grazon Next. I think it's maybe up to a year that because of their residual effect, no clovers, no broadleaves will grow.
Yeah, I think it's 18 months.
18 months. Wow.
I would have to read the label again
Yeah, we
myself, but
definitely
that one
need to
does
read
have
the
a
label on that.
extended
I know that
time.
there's been some issues with people using compost even from manure from animals that were on those pasture fields, or if it was sprayed on a hay field.
Right. Yep. And so that's why those ones have the restrictions of moving things off the farm, because it works well because it has that residual in it, and it's not going to hurt your animals, but the manure that comes out the other end, let's say you had animals grazing a pasture you treated with Graze on Next, and then you move them over to graze a primary alfalfa field. When they defecate on it, they may kill the alfalfa because there's still herbicide residue left from that stand that you'd previously treated. And then if that winds up in somebody's garden compost and kills their tomatoes, well, then they're
Other
upset.
shrubs.
Right. You sell hay to another farm, and then the next year, nothing grows in that spot because there was herbicide residual left in the hay crop. That just gets you all into a world of trouble. And
Right.
So hopefully, and the 18-month restriction is long enough to avoid any issues. We should assume that it's going to take the full 18 months, but hopefully it'll be a little less than that, and that's your max window. But if you're in that business where you're providing manure or hay to another off-farm location, you will not be legally allowed to sell or move manure or hay off the site for 18 months after application of Graze on Next. So you got to be aware of that before you spray. It could really ruin your plans for the next year or two if you're
Yeah,
not aware.
definitely. Real quick, we are coming to the end of the program here. What on clovers, I guess, how much clover is too much? And then second part of that question, what are your, or what ladino or white clovers do you recommend for in mixes or frost seeding and so forth for pastures?
I think it depends on what type of livestock you're rearing on your farm, on how much you would consider too much. But in most cases, I'd look for a healthy pasture mix to be 30% clover, somewhere between 20 to 40. I would call good, with 30 maybe being, ideal for most things. That would be enough to give you your nitrogen boost, a protein boost, but also, reduced issues with bloat. Um, Animals are going to selectively graze in the area, so you could still have some issues if you're only at 20% clover, and if they're continuing to go back to that spot, you may still have some issues. But I think that 20 to 40% window is really where you want to shoot to be. And if you're going to purchase a white clover, go with a ladino type. I'm not preferential to any specific variety or brand name, but the ladino types are improved to have greater leaf area. They still have stolons so that they can creep and fill in the space, but they have a lot larger leaf size and often longer stems, so you can get a more effective hay crop out of them. And you can also have some more uniform grazing heights because those plants are a bit larger than just common white clover.
Yeah, of course, it's been around for a while. I usually recommend Alice white clover. I know that there's several newer varieties that have been um, introduced since then, but it's kind of I think it's a Barenberg product. I can't remember, but definitely it's been around for a while, but it's pretty tried and true method. But said there's many newer these varieties that have been improved varieties that have been introduced. Evan,
Right.
do we
There's a
ever?
lot of red as well.
Okay.
And just wanted to mention this quick. In the on-farm trials we've done so far at the farm, I haven't seen a big benefit of going outside of medium red clover. There's lots of different varieties out there for various purposes, but medium red clover continues to be a steady performer. So it's fairly affordable. It's easy to find. I'd encourage anybody to go ahead and use medium red as well in their frost seeding or reseeding plans.
Okay. Um, any more questions from the audience, Evan?
Overall, quiet.
Okay. Well, Christine, I guess we're at the point of the program that my dad said that there's two types of music, country and western. So I need to know who your favorite country music artist is, or if you have some other genre that you listen to.
Oh, well, if I had to pick one favorite, I'd probably have to go with Dolly Parton. She's just, all around such a fabulous human and musician. She's hard to beat.
Dolly Parton. What's your favorite song? 9 to 5?
Oh, I do like 9 to 5. But I actually really like Little Sparrow
Okay.
is one. Is one of those. It doesn't get played on the radio a lot. I really like that one. And Here You Come Again. I like that one a lot too.
We'll always talk a little bit. I'm a big music buff, and I don't know if I always have a blast from the past artist. So I was actually digging through my parents' record collection. Sometimes it's hard to see, but this is Mac Davis. I don't know if anybody remembers him. Stop and Smell the Roses, and there was a song about Lord, It's Hard to Be Humble. He had some hits in the 70s and 80s, and I think he actually made a movie. It was called North Dallas 40 about football. He was a quarterback, but I don't think he was too convincing as the quarterback. But anyways, I know that he passed away just here during the COVID pandemic. But that's our country artist blast from the past for today. Christine, we definitely had fun talking about spring pasture management. I appreciate you on short notice coming and talking with us. Um, good luck with your Forage Focus program, and we'd love to have you on again. So do you have any other closing thoughts for some of our producers?
Um, well, first off, thank you for having me. I'm glad that this worked out. It was a great way to spend an hour on a Friday, kind of get in the right mindset for the weekend, some smiles, friendly faces. So I appreciate that. And if anybody has additional follow-up questions after the program, feel free to reach out. I put my email there in the chat. I will be going on maternity leave. My last day before leave is May 6th. So if you have any questions, get them into me before then. I'm going to try not to check my email in the leave period. But I guess just my best advice to you is don't do what your neighbor's doing. You're not your neighbor. Make the decision that's best for you. You're not going to have the best results with a copycat program. Everyone's situation is unique. So there's value, of course, in all those conversations you can have with fellow farmers and with your extension educators, soil and water, NRCS. Take everybody's opinion and format it into what works best on your farm, because each one is unique and you have unique goals. So you don't have to be like everybody else. Just do what's best for your farm based on the knowledge you have available.
Yeah, real quick, what's your contact info out there for the Noble County Extension Office?
Our phone number here is 740-732-5681. I'm sticking that here in the chat. And if I can pull it up here quick before
What's
you
your
all
email?
go, it's GELLEY.2, the number 2, at osu.edu. If I can pull up my YouTube link here quick, I will send you the link to where all the Forage Focus programs are housed.
Okay,
I'll send you 2 things. I'll send you our South Center's YouTube channel. If you subscribe to that channel, you'll get notified every time a new show posts. And then I also have a playlist with just the Forage Focus content, because South Center's does quite a few different shows.
great. Again, Christine, thank you for coming on the program. Next week, we will have one of our small ruminant specials. We're going to have Dr. Scott Bowdridge, and we'll also have Stephanie Ringler from USDA talking about parasite control in sheep and goats. We're looking forward to that. And later on in the month, we're going to have Dr. Mahfouz Rahman is going to be talking about the plant diagnostic lab, the development of the new late blight resistant tomato varieties that came from the West Virginia 63. I think Evan will have to help me with this. Mountain Fresh or Mountain Pride just came out a couple years ago. Is that correct, Evan?
I believe Mountain Pride, and there was a second one as well. I forget what it was called.
Yeah, but the story behind that's really interesting, and we're looking forward to having Mahfouz on the program. I just want to remind everyone that programs and activities offered by WVU Extension are available to all persons without regard to race, color, sex, disability, religion, age, veteran status, political belief, sexual orientation, national origin, and marital or family status. And again, we are Mountaineer Farm Talk, the big voice of agriculture here in West Virginia. We enjoyed having Christine Gelley from Ohio State University Extension on the program, and we're looking forward to seeing everyone next week. Thanks again, and enjoy your weekend.